Hi, I'm Jonathan Hayfitz. Welcome to Law and Film, a podcast that looks at law through film and film through law, exploring the rich connections between both. This episode will look at Black Hawk Down, a 2001 film about the U.S. crew of a Black Hawk helicopter shot down during the Battle of Mogadishu during the Civil War in Somalia in October 1993. The battle resulted in the death of 18 American soldiers and hundreds of Somalis. It also prompted the U.S. withdrawal from Somalia after images of dead U.S. soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu by enraged Somalis were broadcast on American television. Directed by Ridley Scott from a book by Mark Bowden, Black Hawk Down is a gritty action movie that captures the brutal nature of urban warfare. But it also provides a window into a host of complex international legal and political issues, and to the opportunities and challenges for humanitarian intervention in the aftermath of the Cold War. Joining me is Greg Fox, Professor and Director of the Program for International Legal Studies at Wayne State University Law School in Detroit. Welcome, Greg. Great to have you.
Thank you, John. Pleasure to be here.
So can you just set up the movie for us? It's an action movie. We got a little context at the beginning of the movie, but tell us a little bit more about Somalia, the colonial background, the Civil War, and the famine that resulted.
Absolutely. This is an interesting movie to be talking about because for younger listeners, this is history. For somewhat older listeners like me, and I suspect you, this is something that we remember from our own lives. Somalia, as many people may know, is in the Horn of Africa, and its history in the 19th century really epitomizes what some historians refer to as the scramble for Africa, this effort by European colonial powers to acquire territory. Over a period of about 50 or 60 years, the British, the Italians, and the French all became established in different parts of Somalia. After World War II, when the Italians were defeated, what was referred to as Italian Somaliland became merged with British Somaliland, and the French continued their control in an area which eventually became the country of Djibouti, and the country that we know today as Somalia became independent in 1960. The background of the conflict depicted in the film is what they refer to in the film as clan warfare. And those clans, there's probably a more precise indigenous term for the groupings that I don't know, but the identity felt by people towards those clans were reinforced by this effective partition of Somalia during the colonial period. But after it becomes independent, there's stability for a period of time. In 1969, a general named Siad Barre stages a coup, takes power, more or less as an absolute dictator, and rules with an iron hand. He is supported initially by the Soviet Union, but then next door, when Emperor Haile Selassie in Ethiopia is overthrown by a Marxist-leaning government, the Soviets switch, and they support the Ethiopians against the Somalis because one of the unresolved territorial issues from the colonial period was over an area called the Ogaden, which both countries claimed. And the United States started supporting Siad Barre. And this happened, from the late 1970s into the late 80s, a somewhat glaring exception to stated U.S. policy of infusing human rights into our foreign policy. There is increasing dissatisfaction with Siad Barre. The dissatisfaction is brought on by food shortages, by a series of environmental disasters that lead to what is effectively famine in the country. And Siad Barre is overthrown in January 1991 and flees the country. And without kind of going into more detail, I think it's fair to say that the country descends into something close to anarchy at that point. The various clan groupings fight with each other, controlling different parts of the country, but there is no central government. And just to preview something that we'll probably talk about at the end of the podcast, that persists until 2012. There is no central effective government in Somalia for this nearly 20-year period.
One of the effects of this civil war that breaks out is the famine, right? And that's, where I think ultimately about 300,000 people die. And that's one of the things that prompts the intervention of the UN.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the famine becomes acute for, as I said, natural and logistical reasons right around the time Siad Barre falls. But what also starts happening, and this is a phrase that was used quite often at the time, the various clans start using food as a weapon. They divert food to their own people, they deny it to others. And so a series of UN aid agencies went in almost immediately after the government fell and were to distribute food, but they had no means to protect their convoys, to protect their personnel, and they were susceptible to all of the tactics that the clan leaders were using. And so it was this famine, which was a man-made phenomenon to much of the outside world, that prompted suggestions for some sort of more forceful intervention. Potentially hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people are going to starve, not because they lack food, but because food that is available is not being given to them. And there's a sense that the international community just simply can't sit back and watch that happen.
And so how does this intervention, this humanitarian intervention, take place in terms of the international legal framework, the UN, the backdrop of the UN charter system, and what's sort of the context for this international humanitarian intervention at the time?
I have to say that you could read the really outstanding book by Mark Bowden, which you mentioned is the basis for this movie, and watch the movie and really get virtually no sense that international law is quite important factor in how this whole scenario plays out. And you can't fault Mark Bowden or Ridley Scott for that. They have this incredibly gripping action tale to tell. And I think they try and get at issues that the legal questions kind of stand for, as opposed to talking about the legal questions themselves. But this is, I suppose, much more of a law adjacent movie than a movie that, kind of deals with law as such. So let me try and do this really quickly because there are entire courses taught on this subject matter. So the question that outside intervention in a country poses is whether that kind of use of force is lawful. And prior to 1945, when the UN Charter is signed, the answer to that question would have been absolutely yes. International law did not impose any restrictions on the use of force. World War II, taught us an object lesson in how a permissive rule like that can go very, very wrong. And so the UN Charter is seen as a reaction to World War II. And in a critical part of the charter language, Article 2, Paragraph 4, the countries drafting the agreement say that the aggressive use of force is now unlawful. And there are only two exceptions to that ban in the charter itself. One is force used in self-defense, which is not an issue here, right? No country has been attacked. And the other is authorization by the UN Security Council, which is set up as the executive body to speak for the international community on use of force. The way the charter envisions the international community responding to aggressive uses of force, what do we do if another Hitler comes along, is that it was going to create essentially a UN army. And another provision of the charter provided that member states would enter into agreements with the Security Council by which they would pre-authorize the use of their troops under a unified UN command structure. And if there was an armed conflict, the Security Council could kind of activate those agreements, and this UN force would go off and do the job. And the underlying idea of this is often referred to as collective security, that the mistake of World War II was to think that wars were only the business of the countries in conflict. And the UN Charter says, no, they're a concern for everybody, because if you leave wars alone to fester, pretty soon they're going to spread and aggressors will be emboldened. And pretty soon we're all in it together anyway. And so why not respond initially? So that's the charter scheme. It never worked. No country ever entered into these agreements with the Security Council. That's largely due to the Cold War, which kind of comes about almost immediately after the charter is negotiated in 1945. And, not only are there no agreements, but the Security Council essentially becomes paralyzed. The Soviet Union vetoes Western resolutions, the West vetoes the Soviet resolutions. For this 40-year period, up until 1989, the collective security apparatus is frozen. But the period immediately before the events in Mogadishu, which are the subject of this movie, is this period of extraordinary transition. It's hard to put an exact date on when the Cold War ends. You can say it's the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The Soviet Union itself doesn't actually come to an end until the end of 1991. But starting in 1989, there's all of a sudden cooperation we're all looking around and saying, well, there's no more Cold War anymore. There are these hot wars in smaller countries, which used to be proxy wars between the two sides. But, we're not fighting those much anymore. Can't we do something about the wars themselves? So there's this kind of unfreezing of the Security Council. And then two other things that really, I think, kind of set the Somalia events in motion. The first is the sense that, and I have to be careful how to phrase this because there's lots of ways that it's described negatively. The most negative is, well, we're now at the end of history. Everybody agrees liberal democracy is the type of government that every country in the world will eventually adopt. And so we, the international community, can just do everybody a favor by going about and promoting democracy. That's associated with a famous article by Francis Fukuyama. I don't think a lot of people now look back fondly at that prediction, but there was a sense that after 40 years of ideological opposition to liberal democracy, there was an opportunity for it to spread. And the new UN Secretary General, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, issued this landmark document called An Agenda for Peace in 1992, talking about how the UN might help not only end local conflicts, but start to help reconstruct these countries along liberal democratic lines. So that's the first thing. The second thing was the first Gulf War. This is the Saddam Hussein, president of Iraq, invades Kuwait in 1990, and which he had long claimed, occupies it. And in extraordinary contrast to the situation during the Cold War, the Security Council reacts immediately. The Council passes a resolution hours after the Iraqi invasion, condemning it, saying it's unacceptable. The US, the Soviet Union, China all vote for this resolution. And Saddam doesn't leave, and there's a series of other resolutions until the end of January 1991, when a US-led coalition goes into Kuwait, evicts Iraqi forces, pushes them a short distance into Iraq, and stops after 100 hours. And this is an extraordinary kind of adrenaline boost to the UN system. Look what we accomplished. The charter, as I said, was envisioned as a response to World War II. We have to stop dictators from invading and annexing their neighbors. We couldn't do that for 40 years, and now we just did. And in relative terms, it went really quickly and really well. And so this also gave this kind of adrenaline boost to the collective security system. So when things start going bad in Somalia, as you mentioned, by the end of 1992, it seemed that 300,000 people had died. The Security Council responds first in January of 1992 by imposing an arms embargo on Somalia to try and decrease the amount of weaponry, and passes a series of other resolutions, and we can talk about what those say. But the idea was that there would be security provided to the aid distribution agencies that would stop the clans from using food as a weapon. That didn't really work. The clans really didn't back down. The clans were participating in a peace process, which was taking place next door in Ethiopia, that the UN was sponsoring. But there was a consensus among Security Council members that wouldn't get going until the clans believed that they couldn't get what they wanted through force. And there was also a sense on the part of the aid agencies that they really couldn't effectively distribute food unless there was a more secure environment. And so what happened over a period of about a year was that the Security Council gradually expanded the mandate of the UN forces. And there were two UN operations. The acronym was UNISOM. There was UNISOM 1, there was UNISOM 2. At a certain point, the Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali, at the end of 1992, reports to the Security Council and says, look, the status quo is unsustainable. Here's a series of options for you to consider. And the options were a spectrum of kind of doing nothing, which clearly he didn't think was acceptable, to authorizing a incredibly robust UN force that would have the authority to use force throughout the entire country and, essentially wrest control from the warlords. Boutros-Ghali was a savvy negotiator. You present a spectrum, either end of the spectrum is unacceptable. So, of course, that the council is going to choose something in the middle. And they did. They chose his fourth option, which created a parallel authorization that in the Security Council talked about a group of member states being authorized to use all necessary means to restore order in Somalia. This was understood to refer to the United States because then President George H.W. Bush had offered that the U.S. would send Marines to Somalia to do some of the hard fighting that would be difficult for UN forces. And in December 1992, the Security Council agrees with the Secretary General and the United States, takes the U.S. up on its offer, and passes Resolution 794, critically invoking Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And Chapter 7 of the Charter is the portion that allows the Security Council to create binding legal obligations. And so when the Security Council says to all the factions in Somalia, you can't interfere with food aid, you can't attack relief workers, you can't do, all these other things that contribute to instability, that's considered a binding legal obligation. Interesting question that may arise in some people's minds. International law is all about relations between countries. The United Nations itself is an organization made up of countries, of states. How is it that that kind of organization can issue legal mandates to non-state actors like warlords? They're not members of the UN. They generally don't have much in the way of international legal personality. Where does the Security Council get the authority to do this? That's a kind of legal innovation, clearly not envisioned by the drafters of the Charter, but it's something the Council has been using ever since. Why? Because most of the conflicts around the world since the end of the Cold War have been civil wars. And necessarily in any civil war, one party is going to be a non-state rebel group. And so that's a power that the Security Council has used all the time. Back to these resolutions, as I said, they escalate in their severity, and we kind of move ourselves up to June 5th, 1993, when a group of Pakistani peacekeepers operating through the UN force, UNISOM 2, are attacked by the forces of one of the clan leaders, a guy named Muhammad Farah Aidid, and 24 Pakistani peacekeepers are killed. That is deemed unacceptable. The next day, the Security Council passes another resolution saying that, and saying critically that the individuals who are responsible for that attack will be held individually responsible. Another innovation, responsible by who? There's no permanent international criminal court. There's no functional Somali courts. Are they going to be extradited back to the United States? Does an American court have jurisdiction over a Somali citizen killing a Pakistani citizen in Somalia? That seems to be open to question, but the Security Council is obviously not happy. So the Security Council says, go get these guys. And, this is something I remember from the time. This was an outrage. The UN is there to help the Somali people, to do good. And Pakistan contributed these peacekeepers because they believed in that mission, and they're murdered for it. We can't allow people like Aidid to get away with this. And so there was a sense that the honor and integrity and kind of mission security of the UN was at stake, and we had to respond. And that brings us to October 2nd of 1993, when Task Force Ranger, which was the quick reaction force that the U.S. had established, goes out to try and capture a number of General Aidid's aides in Mogadishu.
That's such a helpful context to understanding the movie. As you say, it's an action movie, but all this is just in the background, but it's kind of there. I mean, the movie does depict the UN operation. Clearly, the UN is the sort of overarching operation, but clearly you have the U.S. military force and the U.S. Rangers and the Delta Force operators who are leading the primary military intervention. And there's a great scene early in the movie between Sam Shepard character, the American general who oversees the operation, and one of the Somali prisoners. It's a businessman who's high level and appears to have been supplying arms to Aidid. And there's this great dialogue between them, and it captures what you're saying.
General Garrison?
No, thanks. I got one.
These are Cuban. Bolivar, Belicoso.
So is this.
Miami, my friend, is not Cuba. See, not catching Aidid is becoming routine.
We weren't trying to catch Aidid, we were trying to catch you.
Me? But am I that important? I hardly think so.
You're just a businessman.
Trying to make a living.
Selling guns to Adid's militia.
You've been here, what, 6 weeks? 6 weeks you're trying to catch the general. You put up reward posters. $25,000. What is this? Gunfight at the Keo Corral?
It's the okay.
Do you think bringing me in would make him suddenly come to you? Make him more agreeable?
You know where he sleeps. You pay for his beds, much less his militia. We're not leaving Somalia till we find him. And we will find him.
Don't make the mistake of thinking because I grew up without running water, I am simple, General. I do know something about history. See all this? It's simply shaping tomorrow. A tomorrow without a lot of Arkansas white boys' ideas.
Well, I wouldn't know about that. I'm from Texas.
Mr. Garrison, I think you shouldn't have come here. This is civil war. This is our war, not yours.
300,000 dead and counting. That's not a war, Mr. Ito. That's genocide. Now you enjoy that tea. You hear?
So you can hear Sam Shepard, the Sam Shepard character, talking about the famine, to need for the U.S. as a proxy for the international community to intervene and put a stop to it and to get a deed and to restore order. So I think that scene kind of captures a lot of what you're saying in terms of setting up what's going on in terms of the time and the U.S. view and the view of the international community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the movie does a good job in putting out the opposing arguments kind of for and against this sort of intervention. Eversman, the Josh Hartnett character at the beginning of the movie, is the idealist. He says at some point, you know, we look at a situation like Somalia where there's famine and there's anarchy, and we have a choice. We can either join or watch. And it's pretty clear which one he thinks we should do. But at the end of the movie, you know, you hear a kind of voiceover from him, and he's saying, you know, what did we accomplish here? Nobody asked us to come. What are we even doing, meddling in somebody else's armed conflict? And those sorts of debates were going on at the time as well. In international relations terms, it's often described as the kind of idealist versus realist debate. You know, the United States should only use force when its vital interests are implicated. And as hard-hearted as it might be, a famine in Somalia, or even a famine that results from human activity in Somalia, doesn't implicate vital U.S. interests. And so we shouldn't send our troops, expend our funds, expend our political capital in responding to something like that.
Yeah, and you talked about the sort of developments on the international front. From the U.S. context, you have the Vietnam War, right? Ending in the mid-'70s, which has a huge impact in terms of cautioning against military intervention. And then, as you mentioned, you have the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, which is viewed as a success, and things start to shift. So in a way, from the U.S. perspective, you have the intervention in Somalia about 2 decades after the Vietnam War. It seems like some of the backlash to Vietnam has softened, and the U.S. is now intervening again until, as we'll discuss, we have the debacle at the Battle of Mogadishu, and things kind of go back. So it's like there's developments at the international level, but there also seem to be some developments in the U.S., in part because of what happens in the Gulf War and passage of time from Vietnam.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, people refer to something called the Vietnam syndrome, where there's such distrust of the government rationale for projecting U.S. power abroad that there's almost a reflexive opposition to any use of force, you know, regardless of the circumstances. We refer to the first Gulf War as a success, and I think it's kind of retrospectively seen as something that was relatively uncontroversial. It was incredibly controversial. President George H.W. Bush sought Senate approval for U.S. forces, and I think it was only 2 or 3 votes in favor. There was an enormous amount of opposition. So this post-Cold War moment, I think, may have softened that opposition, but as you say later, we'll see that it kind of comes roaring back almost immediately in the aftermath of the debacle.
Well, Greg, you compared this to the Gulf War and how the Gulf War set the stage for what we see in Black Hawk Down. But the Gulf War was a different kind of conflict, I think, as you suggested, than the conflict in Somalia, which is a civil war. So how do those differences play out between intervening in an internal conflict like Somalia and what we would call an international conflict like the first Gulf War?
This is a really important question. I think one thing that the movie does really well is, almost from a visceral perspective, show you how difficult it can be to intervene in a civil war. So in an international war, that is, the troops of one country cross an internationally recognized border and go onto the territory of another country in contravention of the UN Charter, that can be reversed if those troops are sent back to their home territory. And the peace can be secured by making sure that those troops don't cross the border again. And one thing the UN had been doing for quite a while was sending peacekeeping missions to basically sit on those borders, not as an enforcement mechanism. The most UN peacekeeping operations during the Cold War were lightly armed. They never even pretended to be able to repel a new advance by one of the parties. But there is a symbol of the parties' agreement to end the conflict and of the international community's interest in helping the countries work out their differences peacefully. So the peace is secured for the long term by two countries just kind of going back to the status quo ante. In a civil war, by contrast, what usually precipitates the fighting is some sense that the fundamental governmental structures or the group of people running the country or even the configuration of the territory itself is illegitimate. And, rebel groups take up arms because they think they're being oppressed by the central government and they want them out, or they think they never should have been in this country in the first place and they want to secede and form their own country. And sometimes it's a combination of both. How does an outside force stop the fighting in those circumstances and secure the peace long term? You're going to go into a conflict zone where your goal can't be to kind of separate the two parties back into their respective territories. Everybody lives in the same country. And the peace can't be secured by keeping the parties separate. Everybody at some point, in the best of circumstances, is going to have to come back and participate in the same governing structures, live under the same laws, live next door to people who, you used to be shooting at when the conflict was live. And so the intervention in civil wars presents three challenges that I think international law has partly dealt with, but, really not in any completely satisfactory way. The first is it the business of any outside country or an organization like the UN to resolve a civil war? Imagine if there had been a UN around in 1861. Would we have said, yes, come in and negotiate a peace with the Confederacy and maybe we can work something out and, they can have slavery for this amount of time or in this territory? No, we said this is an internal matter. We, the Union, believe that we are right and we are going to fight this war to the end because we simply reject this view of the nation that the Confederacy represents. You have to overcome that barrier. And the UN, essentially, the Security Council has done that, during the 1990s, in the period kind of including but following the Somalia intervention, where a key phrase in Chapter 7 of the Charter that is essentially a jurisdictional phrase that says when it's okay for the UN, for the Security Council to invoke Chapter 7. The phrase is a threat to the peace. And the Security Council has interpreted that language to mean pretty much anything that seems like a problem the Security Council should address. At the time the charter was drafted, threat to the peace probably meant Hitler massing forces on the border of a country he was going to invade. That's a threat to international peace, and the Security Council can act preemptively. But the Security Council has described civil wars as threats to the peace. It's described famine, as in Somalia, as a threat to the peace. It's described kind of widespread international crimes as a threat to the peace. Not long after the Somalia debacle in Haiti, the Security Council described the overthrow of a democratically elected government as a threat to the peace. It's become, pick your favorite clause in the U.S. Constitution that is so elastic as to have no meaning. That's happened. So that first barrier has been overcome. The second one is how you stop the fighting. And you can see in the movie, it's almost impossible to tell who are the combatants, who are the civilians, where are they headquartered, what's their objective, who are their leaders, how do you stop that sort of thing? And what the UN has been doing to kind of overcome this problem has been to try and get peace negotiations going to a point at which there's an agreement on a safe environment. And so there are hundreds and hundreds of Civil War peace agreements that the UN, but also some other international organizations have negotiated. And what the agreements do is express the consent of all the parties, government parties and the rebel parties, that the UN can send in forces. Sometimes the parties live up to those agreements, sometimes they don't, but that consent is generally seen as an essential prerequisite. The third is, how you secure the peace for the long term. As I said, civil wars start because of this perception of the illegitimacy of existing governmental structures and leaders. And the solution the UN has been following, for better or worse, is liberal democracy. You have a vision for the country that you think is a valid one, make your case in an election. And we, the UN, will come and help you, set up an election, we'll supervise it, we'll tell you if it's free and fair or not, and do all the other things that, try and support liberal democracy, rule of law, independent judiciary, things like that. That has been a little bit less successful. But it's hard to think of an alternative unless the UN is going to somehow, assume control over a particular country, which I should say they have done for periods of time. I wrote a book called Humanitarian Occupation about places like East Timor and Kosovo, where the international community for a period of time became the government because it was simply too difficult to get the local parties to kind of organize the transition from war to liberal democratic politics. And so the Security Council authorized, this kind of temporary administration. And that's been successful in some places, probably less successful in more places.
Yeah, just to go back to what you were saying, sort of how the first Gulf War helped create the kind of groundwork or view that, there could be more intervention. I'm just reminded that George H.W. Bush, the first Bush administration, made the decision after Iraq was pushed out of Kuwait not to go into Iraq. So all the questions and all those complexities that you just talked about in terms of internal conflicts were in a sense avoided in the first Gulf War. And I think many, if not all of them, were confronted in one way or another in the second Gulf War when the U.S. went in and removed Saddam Hussein. So it's interesting how they have very different outcomes, the two interventions.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. Yeah, George H.W. Bush avoided a whole lot of trouble by not sending U.S. forces to Baghdad, deposing Saddam, and then figuring out, what do we do now? We're an occupying power. Do we just kind of leave and see what happens? What do we do with Saddam himself? All of those issues, you're right, came up in 2003. We pretty much botched it in 2003. Maybe Bush the elder would have been better at it than his son. Maybe that's one difference. But absolutely. One interesting aspect of that decision not to go all the way to Baghdad was the rationale. In his memoirs, George H.W. Bush said, the reason I didn't go was because the Security Council didn't give me authority to go. The Security Council, in Resolution 678 from 1990, which authorized the use of force, he says, only authorized use of force to reverse the invasion. And so once Iraqi forces were out of Kuwaiti territory, that had been accomplished and he had no more mandate to go further. You can buy that or not. But what's interesting to me is that it's an international law rationale.
Yeah, it's a fascinating piece of history in the way that was relied on, whatever the motives might have been. Turning to the battle, right, which occupies sort of the central part of the movie, the Battle of Mogadishu. And I think the movie alludes to this visually and through some lines of dialogue where you talk about who the U.S. forces would be able to shoot, who they should not shoot, references to rules of engagement. What they're referencing is, well, they're referencing U.S. military law and regulations, but they're also referencing the larger backdrop of the law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, which talks about how force can be used within a military operation with the ultimate purpose of protecting civilians or minimizing harm to civilians. Taking kind of an IHL frame and this principle of distinction between combatants and civilians, what did you make of the film and what's depicted there?
Well, I mean, I think you can tell from our discussion so far that the movie avoids discussion of legal principles as such. But I think it does a pretty good job in kind of describing what the ground rules are. There's a scene where the U.S. commander of the forces is kind of giving a pep talk to the soldiers before they go out. And I think this is the Sam Shepard character, although I can't remember. He says, be careful what you shoot at. People live there. And what he's saying is you are going to encounter a lot of people who are not engaged in combat. There are going to be traditional society, so there are going to be women who are not involved in combat. There are going to be children. There are going to be elderly people. And then there are just going to be people going about their lives who are not shooting. And the U.S. soldiers are told, stay away from those people. And as you say, this reflects a kind of fundamental principle of the law of armed conflict, which is variously referred to as international humanitarian law, or IHL for short, or the law of armed conflict, or the law of war. It's a body of rules most fully embodied in the four Geneva Conventions of 1949 that put limits on conduct in warfare. They apply to all kinds of armed conflict. So there's no overlap or no intersection between the body of law that we've been talking about up to now, which is the rules on when force can be used. Doesn't matter if you are an unlawful aggressor like Saddam Hussein, or you are a country exercising lawful self-defense like the government of Kuwait, you still have these limits on what you can do in armed conflict. The ends do not justify the means. And one of the central principles of international humanitarian law, as you said, is this principle of distinction, that there's a difference between combatants and those who are not combatants. And the primary group, and the one that we're really talking about here, is civilians. But it's also important to know that humanitarian law also focuses on those who are sick and wounded. There's a whole Geneva Convention about them. And there's prisoners of war. There's a whole Geneva Convention about them. And those people cannot be directly targeted. You can't take prisoners of war out and shoot them. You can't directly target civilians. That's not such a hard principle to follow if the circumstances are clear. But there are two situations, and we see both of them in evidence in the film, where the circumstances are absolutely not clear. The first is when you just can't tell who's a civilian and who's a combatant. There's a scene in the movie where it's from the perspective of an American soldier holding a rifle, and there's a woman out in the street, and she's looking down at something on the ground. And the soldier is saying to himself out loud, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, meaning don't pick up a gun, because if you pick up a gun, then I'm going to have to shoot you. At this point, just standing there, you're a civilian, but if you become a combatant, I'm going to have to shoot you, and I don't want to do that. And she goes for something on the ground, and he shoots her. It's very difficult, especially this fast-moving urban warfare, to know who's a combatant, who's not. And there's legal principles that we can talk about, how you make that distinction. The second complication is when a military is not targeting civilians directly, but there's a fairly high likelihood that some civilians are going to be killed when a clearly military objective is going to be targeted. So you are going to hit a command and control center that is situated in a residential neighborhood. And there's no way to take out that military objective. There's no legal objection to hitting the command and control center. But it seems likely that people living around the area who are just walking around or just sitting in their apartments are probably going to be killed. And the somewhat antiseptic term that's used to describe those deaths is collateral damage. And humanitarian law requires this cost-benefit calculus. Is the civilian harm that you think is going to occur justified in light of the importance of the military objective that the military is seeking? And that's a very subjective, context-dependent, morally fraught question that's often asked. And it's faced here under really difficult circumstances. You see endless scenes where there are, Somalis on roofs with guns or with RPGs, and they pop up and the Americans have to respond. How can they tell who's going to get hit by their response fire? Who's in the building underneath where those people are standing? There's a scene where some helicopters come in to provide air support, and they kind of rake the top of a building with gunfire, and they come back and do it again and again until all the people with guns on the roof are killed. How can you tell who else is going to be killed by that? It's a decision that is almost impossible to make in rational, justifiable terms. But, it's a decision that the law of armed conflict imposes on national militaries. And the U.S. military, like many other militaries, incorporates that and other aspects of humanitarian law into their rules of engagement. And so there's something called the Law of War Manual that's put out by the Department of Defense. And it is essentially a very, very detailed elaboration of all of these rules for specific aspects of the U.S. projection of the use of force.
That's a great explanation. And I think the movie, one of the things it does is it gives you a sense of how difficult these decisions are in real time, right? You have this battle the movie compresses it, but it's, a 15-hour battle, intense urban warfare. The thing that's on screen in the movie about the decision whether or not the American soldier can kill the woman if she picks up the rifle. Off screen before the events in the movie in July of 1993, the U.S. had used heavy fire missiles, cannon fire in a house where they thought Aidid would be present. Killing over 50 people, was widely criticized by the human rights community. It also increased opposition within Mogadishu. And I think one of the interesting things in the movie is as the battle intensifies, right, as the U.S., after the helicopter goes down and the U.S., with no man left behind, no person, no soldier left behind, keep sending in reinforcements and trying to get their fellow soldiers out, more violence ensues, and they essentially open, it's like a hornet's nest. The violence escalates. And I think what the movie captures is how much the residents of Mogadishu become increasingly engaged, right, because of all the violence. So I just think the movie does just a good job of capturing some of these dynamics of urban warfare, the difficult decisions that service members, soldiers have to make, and some of the consequences when they make the wrong decisions, or just from the inevitability of the violence in this kind of dense urban warfare situation.
And, it maybe does help you understand a lot of the debates that happen around this question of civilian harm, which, as we're recording this, that's front and center in the conflict going on in Gaza. How do you impose legal rules, which by definition have to have some fairly clear standards on incredibly fraught, fluid situations? And the situations like the Battle of Mogadishu, I think, kind of set up a debate that's often between people who say, you don't understand the context of armed conflict. We have to make quick decisions to save our lives, versus those who say exactly what you did, which is, well, if you go into situations where you think it's likely that there are going to be massive civilian casualties, you may achieve the very limited military objective that you're seeking, but you're going to alienate the population. And if, as I said before, your objective is to plant the seeds of a kind of coherent, law-based society, this is not going to help. This is going to make things worse. There's an actually interesting added complication to the situation you describe. And if you remember, towards the end of the film, when the convoy with all the wounded is coming back and they're approaching the U.S. base, there are Somalis lining the road, but they're all cheering. They are applauding the Americans coming back. And those are obviously, people from the opposing clan, the people who were opposing Aidid. And so it just shows you how kind of complicated intervening in a conflict like this is. Who are your friends at any given moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And the outcome of this, it's a brutal battle. 18 U.S. service members are killed. I think about 70 are wounded. Estimates vary, but hundreds of Somalis are killed, certainly some number of civilians. And then you have these images, which are referred to at the outset, of dead U.S. service members being dragged through the streets, which is televised. This is before the internet, but this is on television. People see these images. The Battle of Mogadishu and the images that were disseminated about it have a significant effect both on the United States and on international humanitarian interventions generally. So what are some legacies of the Battle of Mogadishu?
As far as the United States went, remember that this intervention was authorized by the George H.W. Bush administration at the very end, maybe even after President Bush had lost the election to Bill Clinton. So he was signing off on this and then passing it over to Bill Clinton and said, now it's your turn. And Bill Clinton's reaction was quite swift. He ordered a drawdown of all U.S. forces. Most U.S. troops are withdrawn by the end of March 1994, and UN personnel are out by March of the next year. And President Clinton was very conscious of the political cost that this was imposing on him. And so very shortly after the U.S. forces leave in May of 1994, his administration issues something called Presidential Directive 25, which was an executive order setting the terms for future U.S. participation in UN peacekeeping operations. And it was a very, very limited set of circumstances. PD 25 said, unless a vital national interest of the United States was at issue, the U.S. shouldn't get involved. And in fact, the United States does not get involved in any more peacekeeping operations. Lots of other countries contribute troops, including permanent members of the Security Council. The U.S. is obviously involved in the Iraq invasion, which we claim was authorized by the Security Council. We could have a whole other podcast on why that's a bad argument. But the U.S. essentially withdraws itself from a direct participation. And there's, I think, a really tragic immediate consequence of this. We've talked about the extraordinary turmoil in the world that was happening around this period. In April of 1994, the genocide in Rwanda starts. And this is a killing on a scale that made the Nazis look like pikers. And the Clinton administration does nothing. And there's a wonderful PBS Frontline documentary about this that painfully chronicles the minute-by-minute refusal even to say that genocide is happening, because there was a fear that if the U.S. did acknowledge that, there would be a legal obligation under the Genocide Convention to do something. And I think historical evidence has shown that the Clinton administration simply did not want to get drawn into another African civil war. And so we sat back and watched 800,000 people be slaughtered in a period of a few weeks. A few years later, the civil war in Bosnia heats up. And again, the Clinton administration, despite lots of international pressure, does nothing for a long time. Eventually, there's a NATO intervention, but there's an extraordinary reluctance to do anything, even though there is another instance of genocide, a city called Srebrenica in Bosnia, where 10,000 Muslim men and boys are taken by Bosnian Serb forces out to a forest and shot and put in mass graves. And so there's a real reluctance on the part of the U.S. to get involved. For whatever reason, there's not a reluctance on the UN side. The 1990s is kind of the golden period of the UN becoming involved in trying to mediate the end to civil wars. I mentioned these international territorial administrations where the UN actually takes control of parts of countries. There were 4 of those in East Timor, Kosovo, Bosnia, and then a little slice of Croatia called Eastern Slavonia. Those are extraordinary interventions. The kind of failure to intervene in Yugoslavia and Rwanda gives rise to a Canadian-sponsored initiative referred to as the Responsibility to Protect. This idea that the international community shouldn't sit idly by. There's a lot of debate about what it actually means, but it really was an effort to create a sense of obligation, especially on the part of UN Security Council members, to do something. You mentioned the international criminal tribunals. That's another kind of manifestation of UN involvement in civil wars. You know, their jurisdiction isn't limited to civil wars, especially when we get the International Criminal Court in 1998, but it stems from those initiatives. So that trend continues. You know, there's lots of literature that listeners can look at about what happened to that sense of optimism and possibility. A lot of people say the Iraq War in 2003 and then the U.S. War on Terror did a lot to delegitimize those sorts of interventions. You know, increasing reluctance of Russia and China to vote for these resolutions in the Security Council meant that there were fewer of them. The negotiation of Civil War peace agreements has slowed down a little, not as much. So that's still an area where there's multilateral involvement. But, you know, as far as putting troops on the ground, muscle that will kind of help enforce these agreements, I think the legacy of Somalia really does still haunt policymakers, especially in democratic countries where leaders will have to go to voters and explain why it is that soldiers, we can just take the United States, why American soldiers were sent to die in an armed conflict that was not our armed conflict. It was somebody else's. Why should American lives and, you know, American funds be expended for that sort of initiative?
I mean, in a sense, the events depicted are 1993. The movie comes out in the fall of 2001 after 9/11. So sometimes it's sometimes like a time capsule of a moment where there were high expectations, but they ran into some hard realities.
And the one area which absolutely thrived after this was academic writing on civil wars. So it's mostly a political science literature, and so kind of a little bit tangential to a discussion of law. But for those who are interested, there's a really, really great body of work, empirical work, not philosophizing or arguments about legal authority, but political scientists who look at data from a series of interventions and ask, is it even possible for outside entities like the UN or like individual countries like the United States to bring civil war parties to the peace table? And even if you do that, is it possible to keep the peace in the aftermath of an agreement? I think the evidence is pretty strong that a credible third party like the UN really does make a difference. Cases where there's no third-party guarantor in making a transition from war to peace often end in failure, and success stories are usually the ones where there is a third party. Whether the peace is durable, that's an interesting question. There's a very famous article in Foreign Affairs called Give War a Chance, which makes the argument that peace long-term only happens with absolute victory by one side. Even if you can successfully negotiate and end the civil wars in the moment, resentments are going to linger and parties are going to try and take advantage of opportunities, even in the best democratic systems, and conflict is going to bubble back up. And probably the best example of that today is Bosnia. There was this effort to bring in all three of the major ethnic groups to make sure they were all represented in the government. And unfortunately, the national government, I don't want to insult anybody, but it's not easy to find functional moments in the national government in Bosnia.
Great points. And these issues are even, they're more complicated today given the fracturing in the Security Council and the renewed tensions, put it mildly, between the US and Russia, right? So, this was a moment where in Black Hawk Down, where there was an opportunity, in a sense, from an external point of view, in terms of 10 years earlier, Russia would have been funding a deed and it would have been some sort of proxy war. But it's now even more complicated than it was. What were some of the internal debates at the time in the 1990s over humanitarian intervention?
Well, one of the most interesting ones was whether international humanitarian law, this set of principles that governs the conduct of armed conflict, even applies to the United Nations. The humanitarian law is mostly grounded in treaties, the Geneva Conventions, and then a series of treaties from the turn of the 20th century, the Hague Conventions. Those are all, ratified by countries. But the UN isn't a country. It's its own separate thing. And while you might say, well, of course the UN should follow humanitarian principles. This is an organization that's a creature of international law. Its whole purpose is to promote international law. How can it then violate international law or say it's not bound by international law when it sends its troops into the field to act much like national armies would act? The argument that was made by UN folks was that saying the UN was bound by humanitarian law would imply that it was a party to the conflict. And in fact, if you look at the Geneva Conventions in Article 2, it says that they apply to armed conflicts between high contracting parties. And one of the most important assets that the UN brings to armed conflict, these people said, was its neutrality, that it was not, favoring one side or the other. It was there as to offer its good offices as a neutral mediator, and they were there to help reach an end to the conflict. But saying that they were bound by humanitarian law would legally designate them as a party to the conflict. That debate went on for a while, and then finally in 1999, the Secretary General realized that this was a really bad look and issued a directive saying UN forces are going to abide by humanitarian law. There are still some gray areas like detention. What happens if the UN takes prisoners? What do they do? There's no UN jail. There are courts that we've talked about, international criminal courts, but they're not really there to try regular old prisoners of war. Humanitarian law treaties say that prisoners of war can be detained for the duration of the armed conflict. So is the UN supposed to hold on to these people until the armed conflict ends? That seems a little crazy, but that's an unresolved issue. But in general, things like the principle of distinction that we've talked about are accepted by the UN.
That's fascinating. It actually reminds me of a case that I litigated involving a U.S. citizen who was held in Iraq during the second Iraq.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And so he was held by the U.S., but under the authority of the UN, which raised issues of international as well as domestic law about the jurisdiction of the U.S. courts. So that's another interesting angle on that question. So the film ends with the U.S. leaving Somalia shortly after the Battle of Mogadishu. What happens in Somalia, or what's happened in the last 30 plus years since the Battle of Mogadishu, including we're in the post 9/11 era where the U.S. has been involved through different types of operation, in particular through targeting of alleged groups, al-Shabaab, that are under various theories either part of al-Qaeda or associated forces with al-Qaeda.
It's an endlessly complicated situation. Well, after the US and UN pulled out, the conflicts between the different clans continued. One of the main protagonists in Black Hawk Down, who I don't think we ever see on screen himself, General Adid, he's killed in 1996, and so he exits the scene. The UN made regular efforts, mostly from a distance, to try and create some sort of governmental authority, because Somalia during the 1990s had no central government. It was leaderless. It didn't mean that the country went away. There was still a seat in the UN General Assembly with the Somali nameplate on it, but nobody sat there. I don't know the answer to the question of whether, the UN continued to send Somalia a bill for their UN dues. If they did, they never got paid. But in the early 2000s, the UN Secretary General was able to get the factions in Somalia to agree to a transitional government. Unfortunately, the security situation in Mogadishu was still so bad that the transitional government had to meet in Kenya, which is next door. And as a result, they hardly exercised any authority. As you indicated, one of the other developments is that a group called al-Shabaab, which is, depending on who you listen to, either al-Qaeda affiliated or al-Qaeda adjacent, sets up shop in Somalia. And this sort of anarchy is perfect for groups like that to thrive. They become the target of US-backed intervention by Ethiopia next door. They also become the target of lots and lots of drone strikes by the US, which raises its own legal issues. And it's not till 2012 that the UN finally is able to get the Somali factions to agree to create a government that can operate in Mogadishu, in the country. And has it been effective or not? That's an interesting question, but it's only the last 12 years that there's been a central government in Somalia. During this period, there's another interesting international law issue that's raised. There's one area of Somalia, it's referred to as Somaliland. There's actually another one called Puntland. These are kind of autonomous areas far away from Mogadishu. They kind of set up shop as their own countries and do pretty well. They have functioning economies. They have infrastructure like, water and internet and electricity that is lacking in lots of other parts of countries. And they want to declare independence and say they are independent, but nobody recognizes them. And that question, what does it take to become a state? And particularly, why can't these places that seem to be functioning pretty well as political communities can't become states, but the completely non-functional Somali state in which they are embedded is still a state? That's a whole separate discussion.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating international law question, a political question. If I'm not wrong, I think there are a handful that recognize or would recognize, including Taiwan, which is interesting in and of itself.
They'll take any friends that they can get. Yes, I think that's right.
Well, Greg, it's been wonderful to have you on, talk about Black Hawk Down, and just to kind of unravel all the different threads that lead to these fascinating array of international legal questions of international relations and politics. So thanks again for coming on the podcast.
A real pleasure. Thank you, John.